Hi, thanks for taking the time to review my presentation. I'm going to be presenting a case study today on the Hamas-led terrorist attack on Israel back on October 7th of 2023. This is a disaster, I think, that meets all the criteria required by our assignment for large-scale, an event that had a large-scale traumatic impact within the past 20 years on both individuals and societies as well. I understand the role play aspect of this assignment. But I want to just point out, I'm going to be calling out specific factors intended to comport with the parameters of the assignment as well as the provided rubric. And I'm hoping to make this presentation from an assignment and grading perspective more easily understood and evaluated. That's why I'm doing the introduction with my face here. I'll get rid of that in just a second. But there will be some sort of meta commentary as we go forward on this. But thanks again for being here. And with that said, let's go ahead and begin. So, as this slide sets out, my name is James Schlotzhauer, and this is my Week 8 case study presentation for PSYC514, Disaster Psychology with Dr. Thomas King. Today's date is December 26, 2025, and the assignment due date is December 28th. Now, let's begin by identifying the disaster itself. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas militants launched a coordinated surprise assault across southern Israel. This study delves into the psychological impacts of the terrorist attack, exploring the nature of the disaster, media influences, community effects, and first responder challenges. By analyzing these aspects, I hope to provide a greater understanding of the profound effects of these sorts of large-scale tragedies on individuals and societies as a whole. Now, the images here reflect the very beginnings of the invasion, the Hamas militants paragliding into the music festival, the Nova Music Festival, which became emblematic of the barbarity of the event. Beginning the slaughter itself. I also want to point out that even though I did sort of read a little bit from that slide, as we go forward, there's going to be a lot of information that's going to go well beyond the slides themselves, and I hope to avoid just reading the slides as we go. As an overview of the disaster, from a high-level perspective, the event was a large-scale terrorist attack characterized by coordinated violence, resulting, as I've already noted, in significant mass casualties and hostage-taking. The disaster has led to prolonged psychological trauma that affects not only civilians but also first responders and even national systems, highlighting far-reaching consequences of these sorts of events. The attacks were coordinated by Hamas and were planned and executed as a paramilitary assault. The scope and the nature of the disaster we'll get into in this set of slides. It is profound. This particular image here is one of the dozens of powered paragliders across the international border, alongside dozens of innovative drones and hundreds of infantry-style terrorists attacking festival goers, farmers, families, and homes. We'll get to the references I've used momentarily, but the actual innovation in asymmetric warfare was really kind of astounding here. But that goes beyond our psychological focus. Approximately 1,200 civilians were killed in a single day, along with 5,000 that were wounded in the deadliest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. To put the impact of the death toll into perspective, given the smaller Israeli population, if a population-adjusted event were to have occurred here in the United States, the per capita equivalent of 1,200 would be as many as 40,000 people murdered, with an additional 170,400 wounded. The psychological impact on a small country like Israel was profound. And in addition to the tortured murders, an additional 251 individuals were abducted as hostages and forcibly dragged into Gaza. The targets include kibbutzim, towns, roads, and, as I've mentioned already, the Nova Music Festival, involving mass shootings, barbaric physical violence, widespread sexual assault, and deliberate civilian targeting. These images and maps illustrate the geographic scope, multiple simultaneous breach points along the border, and attack sites spread across southern Israel. You can see the Nova Festival site here again, often referred to or thought of as the emblem or emblematic of the barbarity of the larger invasion, where 364 young people were murdered, abandoned vehicles clogging egress roads, and homes destroyed in kibbutzim like Kfar Aza and Be'eri, burned and collapsed upon families slaughtered inside. The societal nature was profound, and the prolonged uncertainty surrounding the locations and the physical status of kidnapped victims exacerbated personal, familial, and even societal trauma from the moment of the event through the 2 years since. It should be noted, too, that this event was a human-caused disaster, which is a factor that significantly increases personal and societal trauma well beyond those of a natural or technical event. The brutality and unpredictability of the attacks, coupled with intense media exposure, contributed to a high psychological salience among the public. And as an aside, I love language and linguistics, and I stumbled on the term salience in my research, and I wanted to incorporate it here because I just think it's a cool word. In a nutshell, salience refers to the degree that the degree to which something might stand out in your mind and affects your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. High salience basically means it's a dominant concern, and here, shocking, unexpected violence, when constantly shown on the news, makes people feel the event as a major important issue, i.e. high psychological salience, leading to fear, anxiety, desensitization, and a feeling the world is dangerous, creating significant mental impact. Essentially, in more simplistic terms, graphic nature plus unpredictability plus nonstop media equals big traumatic effect and worry. Now, media and political influences were also and have remained huge in this context. There were two key media influences I kind of want to point out, or actually maybe even three. Social media's platforms played a crucial role in amplifying fear and spreading misinformation about the attacks, contributing to secondary trauma for users exposed to graphic content and unverified reports. What's really interesting here is Hamas themselves deliberately released graphic footage of the atrocities on platforms like Telegram and X, and these videos spread virally, providing undeniable evidence of the event that rallied domestic solidarity and international support, but also inflicted widespread secondary trauma on viewers. And I think that was absolutely intended. This was not an unsophisticated attack. This was something that was planned and executed quite well. Directly contrary, though, to those self-promoted, highly documented first-person reports, initial reporting from some Western outlets, including CNN and BBC, were supportive and of Israel, and their coverage was framed in such a way to sort of highlight the atrocities. However, eventually and actually relatively quickly, skepticism about certain atrocities, particularly the sexual violence, sort of took over the portrayal of the events, when then that helped to delay global recognition and condemnation. Yes, CNN did provide real-time reporting at the time, but again, it quickly pivoted to skepticism and distrust of claims made by survivors and first responders, and even some skepticism of some of the claims of the terrorists themselves, which I thought was kind of fascinating. Al Jazeera, on the other hand, is an example of many global outlets that in the later weeks and months framed the events as a humanitarian crisis created by Israel and Israel's swift and profoundly brutal response to the attack, which influenced public perception not only the post-event developments, but it also supported questions as to the veracity of the contemporary claims by the victims. Significant political events included the immediate and strong U.S. response, including President Biden's visit and rapid military aid, enabling Israel's defensive mobilization. Yet that response itself was muddied, I should say, by humanitarian pushback, i.e. the relief pier, etc., that I don't think was ever really built. And then broader Western protests, particularly through the UN, to the ensuing war. which, of course, brings us to the declaration of Israel's war itself and the resulting deeply polarized debates and resolutions at the UN, almost minimizing the attack against Israel's subsequent military actions, complicating humanitarian delivery and international diplomacy. And as I say that, we now get into the international diplomatic polarization, but that the reason I'm getting into these politics, and number one, it's required by the assignment, and it's also asked for by the rubric. But more importantly, this really would have a direct impact on the traumatic resilience, or the resilience of first responders and citizens in this really horrific event, and how it is perceived and supported by the rest of the world. Now, this then brings us then to community and civilian impacts. So impacts on civilians, first responders, and the nation as a whole were absolutely profound. In this section, we're going to start with the individual civilian, and then we're going to expand to the communal impacts. And then that will be followed by impacts on first responders. So one recent study found that 96% of Israelis nationally experienced acute stress symptoms. 96%. That is astounding. Now, that's not saying that that's fully developed ASD or acute stress disorder, but even ASD was observed in 60% of the national population in the immediate aftermath of 10/7. Now, longitudinal studies documented probable PTSD rates nearly doubling in the Israeli population from 16% to roughly 30%, not quite 30%, within months of the attack. Survivors and witnesses experienced acute grief, displacement, anxiety, depression, and intergenerational effects, I think, can be anticipated as well. Southern Israeli communities still remain deeply affected, with ongoing rocket threats compounding the initial trauma of the massacre. From there, we get into other effects, including prolonged grief disorder, which pushed nationally to 48.7% after the event. And again, that's simply astounding. As much as 48.7%, nearly half of the Israeli population, experienced complicated PGD after the attack, which, by the way, PGD encompasses feelings of intense sorrow and inability to move forward after the loss of loved ones. And then survivor guilt often accompanies this as individuals question their own survival and the loss of others. Displacement due to the attacks led to increased anxiety and a sense of identity loss among affected individuals. And the upheaval of their homes and communities contributes to a feeling of instability and uncertainty regarding one's community's future. This leads to and exacerbates a greater generalized anxiety, honestly, with which a huge swath of the national population experiences. I had actual statistics on this, but in the creation of the presentation, I lost my source. But it is, in fact, profound. Now, the attacks resulted in a profound collapse of perceived safety within the diverse Israeli community. There's always, given the nature of the politics and the social concerns within that region, it's never been particularly strong, but this basically caused it to collapse. Residents now feel vulnerable and fearful, and that can lead to heightened anxieties and changes in social behavior, which in turn leads to a disruption of social cohesion and routines, and disruption that can severely affect community resilience. People may withdraw from social interactions, leading to isolation and a breakdown in support systems that help people cope with stress and grief in normal times. And those breakdowns can have a tremendous detrimental effect on post-event society. This then goes even further and then supports the manifestation of intergenerational trauma. If this stuff is not addressed appropriately and effectively, the significant traumatic effects of 10/7 is going to have a tremendous impact on Israeli society for generations. Now, that's just society and the individual. Now, when we get towards first responders and the psychological and health risks of those first responders, and those, by the way, I should point out, include soldiers, it includes civilians, it includes those forensic people who were analyzing or evaluating the scenes, and those people involved in recovery, both of the living and the dead. These are all first responders that all were deeply affected by this. And I would also need to point out that in Israel, first responders, the IDF, people who are deeply entrenched in civilian society. It's part of a national survival. So with that said, let me get to this next slide. And PTSD and complex PTSD. PTSD and complex PTSD are psychological conditions that are really prevalent among first responders everywhere due to exposure to traumatic events in high-risk situations or high-stress situations, and they can significantly impact mental health and daily functioning. And to be clear, by the way, PTSD stems basically from a single traumatic event, like an accident or assault or something like that, while complex PTSD arises from prolonged, repeated trauma, abuse, captivity, war, especially in childhood, but it's again prolonged and repeated, adding to core PTSD symptoms like flashback avoidance and hyperarousal, with extra difficulties in emotional regulation, self-concept, shame, worthlessness, and relationships. A good way to think about it might be to consider complex PTSD as PTSD with added layers of identity disturbance, relationship struggles, and a profound emotional dysregulation due to inescapable recurring nature of the trauma, which in Israel is inescapable. Moral injury, this is another thing I found fascinating, especially as a first responder myself that deals with moral injury quite often. Moral injury occurs when first responders are exposed to situations that conflict with their moral beliefs, leading to feelings of guilt and shame. This can complicate their recovery from trauma and necessitate specialized interventions. Moral injury, incidentally, has been recently identified as a factor in record high numbers of suicide among IDF soldiers. Compassion fatigue is another common issue among first responders who have to consistently care for victims in traumatic situations. This condition can lead to emotional exhaustion, decreased empathy, and burnout over time. And it also has been proven to be a significant factor among Israeli therapists working post 10/7. Sleep deprivation is often a consequence of the high stress nature of emergency response, and can exacerbate mental health issues and impair decision making. This affects up to 31% of Israelis post 10/7, and even more in the first response communities within Israeli society. These next slides, by the way, there's not a lot of direct citation here because I'm referring fairly heavily here on the provided textbook from our class. But first responders also deal with things like injuries during rescue operations, and usually due to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of disaster scenarios. And they can range from minor to life-threatening, impacting their ability to perform their duties. That's common or uniform across all sorts of first response, but in this particular case, it is, in fact, a major issue. Long-term somatic symptoms linked to chronic stress can affect first responders as well, and these include headaches, gastrointestinal issues, and other physical health problems that arise from continuous stress pressure. As reflected in this slide, a significant positive association was found between somatization and disassociation in Israeli soldiers, and the result called for basically I'm speaking a little too quickly, I think. Somatization as a predictive factor of PTSD. Now, you look at, R equals 0.544 and P less than 0.001. Let me just kind of explain that in simpler terms. That researchers studying Israeli soldiers discovered a clear and meaningful connection between common stress responses and unexplained physical symptoms, somatic symptoms, like headaches and stomach issues, etc., with no clear medical cause, and feeling emotionally detached or spaced out from reality. The link was moderately strong on a scale where 1 is a perfect connection and 0 is none, and here it's scored at about a 0.54, and it was highly unlikely to be due to chance. That's what these statistics mean. And it does show that long-term somatic symptoms are, in fact, an issue for first responders in Israel. And of course, there's other high-risk groups, and frankly, this goes back to it goes to general first responders and information provided by our text. That includes paramedics, emergency medical teams. They face, fairly unique challenges given their frontline roles in crisis situations, and their exposure to trauma places them at higher risk for psychological and health issues. The next couple slides too talk about military reservists, but here, civilian recovery tasks. This is really a unique stressor, and Israeli populations with mandatory military service and a deep loyalty to Israeli defense are particularly high risk. Forensic and recovery personnel, just the trauma of the horrific recovery of remains can lead to psychological distress and physical health problems. The recovery personnel after 10/7 face significant issues, as reflected in one of the more recent reports from the state comptroller from the state of Israel. So, here we go. What do we do about it, right? What can we do about it? Following a disaster of this magnitude, how do we assess first responders for trauma-induced psychiatric disorders? Well, here I might use things like the PCL5, which is a questionnaire for PTSD screening, and then combine it with structured clinical interviews and early critical incident stress debriefing sessions. Longitudinal monitoring could be essential to track progression from acute stress disorder to chronic PTSD or ASD moved or evolving into PTSD, and as well as depression and anxiety. These 4 slides above, and we're going to zoom in on them, they do provide a bit more in greater detail. Trauma-informed clinical interviews, right, can focus on the understanding of an individual's trauma history and current mental health needs, ensure a safe environment for them, etc. Standardized tools like the PCL, PHQ, PHQ-9 rather, and the GAD-7 can be used to assess symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, providing quantitative data for evaluation, not just the qualitative stuff that many of us might respond to from an emotional standpoint. And just for clarity, PCL5 refers to a PTSD checklist for under the DSM-5. Which is well, I guess I'll come back to this in a second. Let me go back. So it's a 20-item self-report questionnaire designed to screen for and measure the severity of PTSD symptoms under the DSM-5. Respondents rate how much they've been bothered by each symptom over the past month on a scale of 0, which is not at all, to 4, which is extremely. Total scores range from 0 to 80. A score of 31 to 33 or higher indicates probable PTSD, and it reports a reliable quantitative score, again, quantitative data to track symptomatic changes over time. The PHQ 9 refers to a patient health questionnaire 9, which is a 9-item self-report tool used to screen for depression, monitor depressive severity, track treatment progress. It asks about the frequency of 9 core symptoms of major depression disorder over 2 weeks, scored from 0 to 3, meaning not at all, to nearly every day. Total scores range from 0 to 27, with categories like minimal to mild to moderately severe, and severe. GAD-7, I don't know honestly, it's one of the downsides of an online program. I don't know if it's GAD or if it's GAD, but it refers to generalized anxiety disorder, which is a 7-item self-report scale specifically used for screening and assessing the severity of generalized anxiety disorder. And then total scores there do range from 0 to 21, minimal, mild, moderate, and severe. And it's widely used, even though it's brief, because it is considered to be highly accurate. So all of these tools are validated, evidence-based, and commonly used in clinical research settings because they turn subjective experiences, that qualitative data, into objective numerical data, the quantitative for diagnosis, treatment planning, and monitoring progress. Peer-supported screening models leverage those experiences of first responders to facilitate mental health discussions and support enhancing assessment processes. And then longitudinal follow-ups are crucial for monitoring the mental health of these first responders over time, adjusting or allowing for adjustments in treatment-based progress or setbacks. Now, there are factors that can challenge these processes, and in Israel, and specific to this event and this population, culture and professional stigma, particularly the expectation of toughness in military and religious volunteer groups like Zaka or the IDF itself, is huge in Israel, absolutely huge, which discourages help seeking. The ongoing nature of the war, continued dramatic exposure, is really difficult. It prevents getting an effective baseline because it's just ongoing, and the missile attacks, the political attacks, the social attacks, it just doesn't stop. Severe resource shortages. Israel already had a limited number of mental health professionals, and demand skyrocketed, and it created long wait times for specialized care. These are all challenges to providing services in these circumstances. Now, community resources, though, I mean, we can get into a little bit of what's the strengths and the gaps, right? So, strong resources include a really robust emergency response infrastructure, which ensures immediate and coordinated actions during crises. This is established expertise in trauma psychology, providing for effective intervention and support, and the rapid mobilization of NGOs and volunteers, which can enhance community resilience and aids and recovery. Now, specifically to Israel, we've got the Israel Trauma Coalition, which provides a coordinated nationwide response, training thousands of providers and establishing support networks. And you also have NATAL, NATAL, which is the acronym for basically in English, the Israel Trauma and Resiliency Center, which dramatically expanded its helpline and delivered evidence-based trauma and resilience programs subsequent to 10/7. Now, on the other hand, there are notable gaps in community resources, like the need for long-term mental health follow-up, which is crucial for sustained recovery. Additionally, there's additional culturally responsive care for minority groups. Israel is it surprised me when I delved into this, how diverse Israel actually is. There is a lack of culturally responsive care for minority groups, which can hinder effective support. And then finally, scalable services for displaced civilians have to be improved to address ongoing needs of those affected populations. Specific areas, again, insufficient numbers of mental health professionals leading to overwhelming wait lists, and inadequate long-term community-embedded programs for isolated populations like those in the South, and specifically, too, for volunteer responders. Excuse me. So, community outreach recommendations. 2 suggestions for improved community outreach would be to launch public anti-stigma campaigns, paired with peer-led support groups in affected communities to help normalize seeking help. Deploying mental health units and school-based resilience programs for early intervention, especially targeting children and families in this society, would really be helpful. So there you go. I tried to speak as quickly as possible. I have once again, it's another long presentation. However, Israel has faced tremendous social, political, and psychological battles within their own society and within their own populations, both before and after 10/7. But they've met their challenges with a tremendous resilience and strength. But that continues, and it requires, however, a continued self-reflection, internal response mechanisms, deeply personal self-regulation when navigating existential threats, both within and outside their borders. Adapting a flexible community and individual trauma-informed approach to personal and communal issues is going to be crucial to their survival, separate and apart from existential threats outside their control. It's remarkable, the depth of existential threat, the depth of trauma and horrific circumstances, and how well the Israeli community has in fact handled that, even if there are some continuing gaps necessary or identified and that could be addressed. Once again, comporting with the requirements of the assignment and the rubric, we do have several references here, and I have broken them down just mostly from spacing now into these. I will point out a couple of things. a couple of these studies were remarkable to me and really fascinating. The comparative, as someone who likes language, who is interested in linguistics and actually is also interested in political framing, the comparative critical discourse analysis of the language use between CNN and Al Jazeera was really a remarkable study. Here we have our text, which is remarkably dated, and whatever, it is what it is, but it does provide a solid baseline, and that was a good a good source to have. In this set here, the nationwide perspective study by Levi Bells was particularly interesting to me, and provided some tremendous statistics, or some good statistics. And then finally, and I know this goes beyond just the psychological aspect, but the drones and the Hamas-led attack, innovation and implications, perspectives on terrorism, goes beyond the psychological, but my gosh, was it fascinating. And this, when it comes to asymmetric warfare, this event was, I keep using the words astounding and remarkable, but it truly was. Anyway, that's my presentation. I do appreciate you taking the time to see it. Dr. King, I appreciate your classes. I am moving on to capstone and moving on after this. Thank you very much for this and for the deployment class. These were two of my favorites in the entire program. And if anyone does view this and wants to reach out, feel free to do so, and I can be reached through AMU. Thanks so much, and you have a good day.